So, Kalispera. It's really an honor to introduce Dr. Ariel Levite in this meeting that it's part of a strategy course, so some of our graduate students are here. Let me say first a few words about Dr. Levite and then about his topic today. Dr. Levite is a rare individual. He combines both the academic, the think tank, and the government world. So he has really done the revolting door between academia, think tanks, and government. He is producing books published in university presses like University of Columbia Press, Georgetown University Press, like a full-time academic. But at the same time, he works in think tanks, he's advising governments, and also working in government. He was the head of the International Security Department of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Then he moved to become Deputy National Security Advisor. He actually was one of the creators of the Israeli National Security Council. Then after, he moved to become number 2 in the Israeli Nuclear Commission in charge of policy. So he had a lot of academic experience in the Israeli security system. Then he moved back to the university from Cornell. He was at Stanford, and in between he created some consulting companies, and now he is a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. He is working there on cyber warfare. Actually, 6 months ago he published a book on cyber warfare. And he's in charge of the nuclear policy unit. He's with us today and tomorrow. Today he will talk about the changing face of warfare, and tomorrow he will talk about nuclear issues at the level of industry and at the level of nuclear proliferation. So, if you want to hear the second lecture of Dr. Levite, it's tomorrow, same room at 12 o'clock. Now, before I introduce his lecture, since this is part of a strategy course, I will say that we teach the development of war and the development of strategy, from Thucydides to Sun Tzu, to Machiavelli, to Clausewitz, to modern warfare, and to nuclear warfare. But today, Dr. Levite will claim that everything that we teach is completely irrelevant because the war has evolved. Now the world involves data, involves machines, involves society. So the traditional army-to-army model of war, it's not longer applicable. So it's a provocative presentation, and we will be thrilled to listen to Dr. Levite. Before I give him the floor, I would like to ask the Chief of Army, Lieutenant General Alkiviadis Stefanis, which was a speaker last year in the same course, to make a brief presentation. General, it's really a privilege and honor to have you here, and I think it will be an honor for us to listen to your words.
Thank you. The honor is mine to be among you. I was not prepared for that, so I will be very... my speech would be very soon. First of all, many congratulations for this event. Sir, thank you very much for being with us. You have to know that there is a great cooperation between Hellenic Armed Forces and Israeli Armed Forces. We are doing a lot of things in different levels, at the strategic level, at the operational level, and at the tactical level. The coming week, 7, 8, 9, and 10, I will be in Israel, and I will meet the chief of the Israeli ground forces in order to find ways to enhance our cooperation. And he was with me last month following training activities of the Hellenic Armed Forces. Very proud for that coordination and looking forward to enhance that coordination. Two things concerning the issue of Professor Spitz. I would like to mention the leadership factor of people, data, and machine. And I believe that whatever the machine is, whatever the mean of the war is, leadership is the critical point and the critical factor in order to achieve our scope. We have to think about that. In the army, we used to say that what is the best weapon? Always there is that question. What is the best weapon? The answer is the weapon who has the best crew. So having people with spirit, with morale, the most of the times we are winning. So again, thank you very much, sir, for giving me the offer to be here, and all the best to you. Looking forward to see you again, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Levite, the floor is yours.
Yes. Good evening. Thank you for having me here. I'm privileged and honored to have General Kaviadis Stefanis here in general, and finding time in his precious schedule. I know you will have to leave before I won't take it personally, but I'm hugely grateful for this, even happier, the context that you have introduced. And of course I fully agree with you about that the quality of people makes the difference. One should not make any illusions about machines operating by themselves or data existing all by itself. I'm very grateful to Professor Platias for inviting me. We have been brainstorming in general we just concluded, I can't mention the figure how many, but very, very close to 40 years of academic exchange. I still remember the first paper that we had the audacity to publish together in 1980-81, when we were both wrapping up our PhDs. And including on this particular issue, which with under the auspices of the Office of Net Assessment of the Pentagon, we did a workshop last year in Washington to discuss the changing nature of warfare. So what I will try to do until the break is basically present you the thesis of what I think is different, but also where there is continuity, and the mix therefore is the interesting aspect. Then after the break, to answer whatever questions and have a discussion going on. So it shouldn't be a monologue, nor should it even be a dialogue the way Israelis define it. You know, dialogue is distinguished from a monologue that two people talking to themselves. So that's not what we have in mind here. I actually mean a dialogue. So let me, without further ado, let's get started. I tried to concentrate all of my arguments into one slide that tries to tell you what I think has changed already or is changing. So let me go through a few of the points. We looked at confrontation in our minds. Somehow we got to the perception, mainly the post-Westphalian perception, that war is something that is fought between armed forces, exclusively between armed forces, or at least predominantly by armed forces. When you actually look historically, that was never totally the case. And I would argue that it's less the case today. I will go into the details of that argument later. So in that context, we devised some rules for the game. And those rules for the game basically said that there will be a declaration of war, so there will be a clear distinction between war occurs and war stops. So war may be a continuation of politics and other means, but there is a formal cut between war and politics by going in both directions and so on. Neither is the case today. We talked about formal authority to declare war. There was just a change in the Israeli law, I don't know if you followed it last week, of what a formal authority is actually necessary to declare war in unusual circumstances, and it was concentrated just in the hands of the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister. But who declares wars these days? You go to confrontations, nobody declares war, even when the militaries are involved. And I'm not talking about just dictatorship, and I'm not just talking about small countries. Even in the United States, the president has been trying to seek congressional approval for military action now for a decade, and the Congress doesn't want to take this issue up. Because Congress is the only one who actually has the formal authority to declare war, or to grant the president the authority to do it. So, And so the demarcation between the peace and war, the declaration of peace and declaration of war and so on, has become very, very blurred. We used to think that fundamentally war involves two things: conquest, that is territory changing hands, and destruction of military gear. We have very intense confrontations these days, more than ever, in which neither of these occurs. Not military gear is being destroyed, and conquest of territory doesn't happen. People get killed, firearms are being used, and so on. Soldiers are deployed, people risk their lives, material damage occurs, but it doesn't involve change of territory, and in most cases it doesn't even involve destruction of military gear as the purpose of the exercise. So it's really a dramatically different situation. It doesn't mean that those do not occur or would not occur, and we shouldn't be prepared for those situations. I don't want to make here any, those could still occur. But we have to be prepared also for something else which is very different from the stuff that we've been training for, recruiting for, equipping for, and building the organization to engage in. We assumed that warriors will be wearing uniform and reporting to hierarchical institutions. But many of the warriors these days do not behave like that. They are dressed as civilian clothes. They hide among the population. They're still using firearms, or they're using improvised munitions, or cars, buses, trucks, bulldozers, you can imagine, and other types of equipment and so on. And the organization is often improvised, even inspirational. They don't know each other, but they got the inspiration from somewhere, with the encouragement to take things into their own hands. So the perception that there will be an organization, there will be a head of the organization, if we influence him or her or whatever it is, we will get our result, is no longer a valid proposition. We believed that if there is a military confrontation, it means that you need geographical contiguity. Someone has to be next to the other. But we now see cruise missiles being fired from hundreds and thousands of kilometers away, not to mention reconnaissance and other things of that nature. No geographical contiguity. We see growing capability to launch things from space. So the physical contact that used to be the defining, in the Israeli Air Force they had a big debate whether the people who operate UAVs should be considered warriors or not. And the issue was, if you measure a warrior in the sense of using firearms, they're warriors. If you measure warrior, someone who risks his life in the exercise, they're 5,000 miles away and they're using firearms. So the traditional consideration of what, should they be rewarded like warriors, promoted like warriors, or should they be differently? And one could make very passionate arguments, but you understand the revolution in our thinking about warfare when this is occurring. So no physical contact and no geographical contiguity. This could be from people who are thousands of miles away and so on. And lastly, and perhaps the most dramatic development, that we could conceive of warfare occurring other than between human beings. We're increasingly seeing a trend towards the development of capabilities that would operate all by themselves, would be completely autonomous. Look at the films that the US Navy has recently released of a swarm of battleships, small battleships that would be operating completely independently and coordinating between themselves, all using artificial intelligence. And the introduction of further nuanced capabilities of artificial intelligence and remote sensing and all of those things and so on, that's the name of the game. And I will in a minute argue that this is totally connected to the human dimension, and why the sense was that given the changes in warfare, once wanted to depersonify the fighting capabilities. So you don't put people in harm's way and you can still conduct warfare. So the point I want to leave with you at this end of this first slide is that for all the fundamental premises, from a legal, operational, organizational, technological, that guided our thinking about warfare are all now under duress. It doesn't mean that there isn't an element. It doesn't mean that those could not happen. But it does mean that we're dealing with a very different mix that we used to deal with in the past. That we need to be agile in thinking about how do we confront those kind of challenges that come upon us and so on. How our adversaries could take advantage of them. How we could neutralize those advantages and take advantage of ours ourselves, whoever our adversaries might be. How do we create flexibility to deploy them in contexts that were different from the ones that they were readily development? And perhaps the most difficult question is how to use legacy capabilities against new types of situations. Because we can't change the people, the equipment, the organization overnight. That's not possible, that's not practical. It takes 20 years, 30 years. Even if you have a government that is now finally realizing that they have to put more money into defense, it's clear that this is not a practical proposition. So, to go back to the comments of the General earlier, it's the people and the capacity to think creatively and to adjust to this new reality. So, I've already tipped my hand. And as a result, let me go over a few of the characteristics of warfare as I see it today. So one is, it doesn't stop. It's constantly going. There it could be higher level of friction, lower level of friction, this form, that form, and so on. But it's ongoing. So that's one. And we understand that it's not just armies fighting each other through physical contact on the battlefield that is exclusively armies fighting armies and so on. Warfare is increasingly done by standoff, and will be even more so in the future. And the efforts underway facilitate by modern communication, facilitate by modern sensing, facilitated by artificial intelligence and so on, is moving in the direction of to do much more warfare by remote control. Ultimately all the way to completely autonomous capabilities. But even if we assume that autonomous capabilities, because of legal or political reasons or others, would take a long time to be fully evident and so on, the process in the meantime will be a process where standoff capabilities will become quite dominant. Global. The major conception of warfare had ultimately a sort of a territorial, a localized aspect. There is no reason to expect that that would be the case. Our battlefield is essentially a global one. And the warriors are a funny combination of standard forces, but also proxies and mercenaries and volunteers. And the last category, I'm not even sure that the word in English exists, inspirees, people who are inspired to do certain things, that they may live in your midst and will be inspired at one point or another to become a fifth column that could become terrorists and so on. And I don't have to tell people in Greece that among lots of refugees and others who are completely decent people, you can never be sure that you have a significant number of those. And when we have those ethnic bridges, that sort of and territorial heterogeneity, and I was talking to Professor Platias and some other friends here at the department earlier and so on, obviously in the bigger cities, because that's where the population is so heterogeneous and so mixed and so wide and so on that these people can actually operate and seek cover and so on. So the lines are blurred between warriors, criminals, bystanders and so on. And the people in uniform who used to have the strongest possible discipline of distinguishing between, by the way, much more so than intelligence operators. Right? The US is operating the UNVs under two very different rules of engagement. The military is very clear, very strict, and so on, those distinctions and so on, higher authorities and so on. The CIA is operating by completely different rules of engagement. We judge the military against that standard, but it's a standard that becomes very difficult to determine, and so on. And so the military people find themselves in a very difficult situation. And sometimes it actually says, okay, we won't task the military to do those things, we'll hand them to paramilitary organizations or intelligence services or things of the nature. when you read the Russian and Chinese literature, but not just the Russian and Chinese literature, the concept that war is actually a hybrid, I think. Not just hybrid in terms of interdisciplinary, in terms of the military services, but hybrid in the sense that it operates on the information level, on the cognitive level, on the logistical level, and so on the ideological level, and also on the physical level, and so on. And in that sense, a new meaning to totality of warfare, and so on. We used to believe that one undergoes warfare. What happens in the battlefield is not immediately transparent. Obviously, the number one characteristic of warfare that we've all grown up on was characteristic of uncertainty. The fog of war was always the fog of war. Thank you, General. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Τη μαγνητοσκοπούμε τη διάλεξη, οπότε θα σας τη στείλουμε.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Χάρηκα πάρα πολύ. Καλή συνέχεια. Θα τα πούμε σύντομα.
We used to think that the fog of war, the uncertainty on what's going on, where your forces really are, where your forces are, where the enemy forces, and so on, ultimately may lead to imperfections, mistakes, problems, and so on and so forth. When the battlefield now becomes transparent, because there are handicaps or there are social networks, and everyone has a camera on his mobile phone, and so on, not to mention imaging techniques that are satellite-based that are now completely commercially viable. What is happening on whatever battlefield it is not just quite fast relayed elsewhere and so on, but the people who use military capabilities to have an information advantage find it very difficult that others that are merely using cheap commercial capabilities can confront them and would neutralize that advantage. We're seeing that with Hamas and with Hezbollah as Israelis and so on. Which takes me to the next point, namely that commercial technology has been to a large extent equalizer. Think of the following aspects. Imagery. I was talking to a guy who was a very senior official of the American Imagery Agency, NIMA, National Imagery Agency, mapping and imagery. The guy said, look, everything we used to do, you can now do very cheaply, much more efficiently, using commercial imagery. What is our relative advantage these days? So that's with imagery. Location services, GPS. Everyone now has a GPS. In your car, in your mobile phone, everywhere you have a GPS. Secure communications, you're using WhatsApp or its equivalent. We used to invest an unbelievable amount of money to get the cryptographic standards and so on, and to protect them against any thieves or spies or whatever, and so on and so forth. Imagine, but now you have secure communications. I could go on and on with this. Look at what's happening with drones. It used to be, high-tech military capabilities. You now go into the shop for $300. You buy a drone. You improvise. You put on it whether you want a camera, you wanted it a laser designator, you want to put on it high explosive, right? So you can do swarms of those for what? For a few $100s. The smaller ones even go for whatever, $50, $100. So commercial technology, just things off the shelf from a toy store or Amazon. We used to think that warfare is fundamentally a warfare that is physical in nature. But as I began to imply, and I'll get to more into later, current warfare is more and more occurring on the cognitive and logical domains. The Americans, when they're now talking about cyber, says that cyber actually brings together three dimensions. There is the physical dimension, there is the logical dimension where the data is, and there is the cognitive dimension. And they're trying to cyber to operate on all three. That's right, cyber warfare capability. I'll get to more of that as we go along and so on. I think that we see in the course of the discussion about the US elections, it became abundantly clear that what happens is we're seeing some very advanced forms of weaponizing information. Now, mind you, this is not entirely new, right? We have seen in weaponization of information in antiquity, and we've seen it in modernity. But the ability to do so on a large scale, to do it very quickly, to do it very cheaply, and to do it in a targeted way, that is new. Spread of rumors existed elsewhere. Spread of conspiracies occurred elsewhere and so on. But now almost everyone can do it quickly. How much did it cost the Russians to actually meddle massively in the US elections? $100,000 of ads that they bought on Facebook. Imagine what such a campaign can do, and so on. So it cost them a little bit more to out of this troll operation out of St. Petersburg and so on. And again, I'm not picking up on one or the other. I'm just giving you a feel for what new warfare actually looks like. I've already referred to the fact that we do see a trend towards increasingly unmanned warfare. We have seen the biggest development with unmanned air vehicles. That has been the biggest development of that kind. We've previously seen very spotty and isolated things of underwater assets and things of that nature and so on. But now it's much more prevalent in terms of the areas in which it operates, and much more affordable, and much more actually involved directly in warfare. And the pressures to move to completely autonomous capabilities and overcome the ethical and institutional and legal issues associated with this, people would say, well, the necessity, proportionality, and so on could actually be met using autonomous capabilities. But I would argue that everything that I've said thus far pales in comparison to the biggest and most dramatic development, which is this one that I've just projected to you. The new battle space, the most dramatic battle space, and perhaps the one that will be the most decisive in the future, is the battle space over data. What is happening in this? So first of all, I want to impress on you a battle space for all practical purposes. Number one. But what is interesting, it's not just a battle space alongside the others, the air and the sea and the land and so on, and the space. It's something that cuts across all of them. So it's a battle space that cuts across all of the other battle spaces and so on. And I would argue that it has 4 parallel dimensions that we need to understand. And we need to understand the dynamics of warfare in each of those dimensions and across those dimensions. So let me spend a minute here on this issue because I think it's so central. So one is the effort to acquire the data by building advanced sensing capabilities. In essence, every person today is a sensor, or even a multi-sensor, because you have a mobile phone, and you have your eyes, and you have your ears, and so on. But now you're not only able to see and hear and smell, and so on, you're also able to communicate that information, or record that information, and communicate that information. So the first fight is between the acquisition and the evasion. The ability, there was a story, I think in the last 2 days in the New York Times, they were telling the Chinese had spied in the US, according to the New York Times story and so on, and developed a new technique that the plane, a fighter plane in the sky, all of a sudden disappears. It disappears from the radar or from every other detection capability. It continues to fly and could do everything, but it disappears. So we have a fight between the acquisition of data and the evasion of data, with dramatic developments occurring in that area. The second is this data is completely meaningless if it cannot be transmitted. Either people in your units, to other units, to the command post, to the political leadership, to allies, to explain to your population. So the second one is transmission. Transmission of the data, or the ability to interrupt it, to deny it. That's the second battle space in the data front and so on, the transmission versus denial of transmission of data. It's not just the physical it's the space and the bandwidth and all of those aspects associated with data transmission. The third battle is over the integrity of data. How can you have trust in what it is that you're communicating and sensing? And how can you spoof that data? Not just deny its acquisition or deny its transmission, but somehow corrupt what cuts across. Now you understand that if we are moving increasingly to remote capabilities, and in the future towards autonomous capabilities, if you actually spoof it, which means you corrupt the data that is the basis of the algorithm or the operations and so on, you can create horrendous consequences. So the third battle space is a battle space over the integrity of the data. And the fourth dimension is the capacity to take the data. Let's assume that you collected the data, you've transmitted the data, and the data is accurate. You still have a fight over the ability to rapidly analyze that data and reach conclusions on that basis, because things are moving faster and faster. So the fight is between the ability to store and process big amounts of data and derive from the conclusions, and efforts to prevent that exercise from taking place. But if you think about this, I talked about the military aspects of this, or the intelligence aspect of this. This is also occurring in Facebook and in Google and other areas and so on. So all of what I've talked to you about is not a predominantly military activity, although it has profound implications for warfare, as I see it in the modern era, and so on. Now, if you assume, as I do, that the impact on the physical world that we actually live in, that we breathe in, that we eat in, that we drink in, that we move in, and so on, increasingly relies with the two other levels, the data that we have and the control mechanisms that ultimately provide us with the ability to move around and so on, or to provide us energy, or to provide us water or fuel and so on, then you understand that the fact that you can influence this logical world, and through this impact of the logical world, we would have an impact on the physical world. That's the most profound implication for warfare of the future. So it's not that we control the computers increasingly control us and control vital aspects of our lives, including in warfare. I'll give you one example. And if we manipulate those, it has profound implications. Let me give you one specific example that I think people are now just beginning to realize how profound it is. It's positioning, navigation, and time data. We used to think of GPS, when we think about it in day-to-day parlance, we normally think about GPS as something that gives us a location. But the GPS signal also gives us a time signal. And the time signal is absolutely critical now for synchronizing bank transfers. For example, when we're trying to log on to our application to the bank and so on, the bank is trying to verify our location. But it's also synchronizing energy production through a time signal and so on, and air traffic control, and many, many other things. And so if you deny positioning and navigation and time data, or worse still, corrupt it, you could paralyze a society, a modern society. And it would come as no surprise to you that even a relatively quote-unquote primitive country like the PRK had done a PNT attack on the Republic of Korea, which in one day produced $800 million damage. And I would argue to you that this is actually happening now on a daily basis, PNT attacks. And that's the wave of the future. So data is the critical aspect of what we fight over, to acquire it, to process it, to transmit it, and so on, and PNT data being the number one. And to build resiliency against this, we're only beginning to live up to the consequences of that reality. But now let me move on and talk about the aspects that were mentioned by General Kaviadis Stefanis about the people. So, what do I want to tell you about the people? The social dimension in strategy is nothing new. It's always been there. It's been there in the thinkers about strategy. Thankfully, one of the smartest among them here is to my left, and so on. And it's also been quite well understood by the practitioners of strategy and warfare and so on. I've mentioned some of these names and so on. I remember still a conversation with Professor Platias in which we began to discuss this topic and this frame of looking at warfare. And he said, how did Thucydides convince the Athenian population to give him a free hand and that would inspire him, that would give him a fighting chance to try and defeat military superiority, Sparta? And the answer was, we'll try to do a social manipulation within Sparta by doing some targeting of the slaves, and if the slaves refuse to play the part that they are and run away and so on, we will paralyze Sparta. And that has produced the first ceasefire in the Peloponnesian War. So you understand, all I'm trying to impress on you now, that this was not just a thinking about people, manipulation and the role of people and so on in warfare, but also the practice has been there. There is a fascinating aspect of this. I refer you to the book Professor Platias has written about this topic. So for Karl von Clausewitz, society was one part of a trinity. There were several trinities that he was discussing, but one of them was the government, the military, and the people, and the relationship between them. More recently, about, 40 years ago, 35 years ago, and so on, Michael Howard discussed 4 dimensions of strategy: operations, logistics, technology, and people or society, and the relationship between them, and said that at different wars, or sometimes in different stages of the war, one of them was more dominant than the other. The most interesting aspect of Howard, however, was the following: that not only was the 4th dimension, people, society, important and at times dominant, his argument was that the obsession with nuclear technology after World War II had actually made us forget about the societal dimension. Which is a really, I think it's a seminal observation, but also a quite remarkable one. Because if you think about it, what did nuclear targeting involve in the Cold War, and mostly even since? What it meant that you target populations, and that you are not just able to contemplate genocide, but you are able to contemplate Armageddon. And in fact, you don't even need to use the weapons. You just threaten their use and you're already successful. In fact, you're only successful if the threat of the use of them against those populations creates some motivation and so on. So it's really awkward how the social dimension and its centrality somehow got sidelined because of the obsession with technology. My argument, our argument, is an argument we've discussed a lot with this workshop that Professor Platias was taking part of, that this is even more true now. But there is one more element that is quite striking, and I'll go through it. I'll show you in a minute what I'm actually talking about, society-centric warfare, so you get a full feel for it. But I just want to lay out this thesis: is that if we are trying to influence human behavior, societal behavior, not just as individuals, but as collectives, or as a collective, the fact that we're doing it without the wisdom of behavioral studies, and here I'm talking as an academic as well as a strategist, is completely incomprehensible. And so I think that one of the areas we're talking here and trying to put together a research program here that I think is possible only with a country that has both the rich historical legacy as well as the brilliance to think about those issues, is how do we marry behavioral studies with military strategy. I may have gone in the wrong direction, have I? Wait just a second. Okay, so my argument is that society-centric warfare is now commonplace, prevalent, in fact. The battle space is everywhere. We're dealing with human beings, we're dealing with societies, we're dealing mainly with urban areas. Why urban areas? We've already discussed some of those reasons before. The ability to produce impact in urban areas is the largest. Hamas is targeting Israeli urban areas with rockets. By the way, interestingly enough, even when they know that we can shoot down every single one of those rockets and missiles, they still do it because they want to intimidate the population. So they take it to the extreme that the physical effect will be zero or close to zero, and the cognitive effect would still, the political effect would still be profound, both in terms of telling their population that they're not totally impotent, as well as the capacity to impress on Israeli society and the others that there is a price for war. And Hamas is just one example, Hezbollah and others, and so on and so forth. So the battle space is everywhere, and particularly in urban areas, and there is the concentration of the media there, and others you can tap on, and so on. What is remarkable, I've already alluded to the fact that the Hamas and Hezbollah do it. For the Russians and the Chinese, this is mainstream. But when you actually see what the Americans were trying to do in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and in the last week what you're seeing in the developments in Gaza, what Israel was trying to do and so on, you understand that this is something that is ultimately practiced, in some cases reluctantly, in some cases strategically and voluntarily, by everybody, the large and the small, the state and the non-state, the east and the west, and so on. In some cases, the targeting of the societies and parts thereof is completely deliberate and discriminate. And in others, people see actually a virtue in indiscriminate targeting. After all, what did we see in the nuclear age? The indiscriminate targeting or holding at risk of full societies was the name of the game in the nuclear era. All I'm saying is that we see more and more of this in the conventional era that we're now dealing with, and so on. So it's not just by choice, it's sometimes inadvertently, and I don't think that this can change. So in some cases it's pre-planned, in other cases the transition towards this type of warfare is spontaneous. I've already alluded to the fact that the cognitive manipulation, the direct cognitive manipulation, that is, if we used to conquer territory and then try to shape the perception of the people, or shape the perception of the people through the conquest of the territory. But now, the efforts to engage in cognitive manipulation doesn't require the conquest of the territory. It can be done from afar. It can be done just by the injection of data or the manipulation of data, and so on. And the tools that are being played in this domain are both the traditional tools and a new armory, I will show it in a second, and so on. And the impact is both direct and indirect, and so on. So if we look at the evolution of societal warfare, and we look at along four axes here: societal involvement, coercive logic, organizing principles, and who is fighting whom, and so on. What our position is that we have seen all in the 21st century basically moving in this direction. So that warfare involves maximizing societal involvement, the coercive logic being more manipulative rather than direct, that we have the organizing principle is increasingly inspirational as distinguished from hierarchical, and that the protagonists are increasingly societies versus societies rather than armed forces against armed forces, or even a hybrid. And now let me get to perhaps the most dramatic illustration of what I'm talking about. It's an effort to use a Greek word, Pentagon, and to try and show you through this amazing Greek world, which obviously is also the Pentagon in the physical sense, but I think the conceptual change, the sense, is much more important than the physical sense here. So let me go over each of those and explain to you what I have in mind here, if I can actually make it technically work, which is going to prove a bit of a problem, but I hope I'll succeed. So, my argument is societies are becoming a direct object, both to try and change their attitude, but also to trying to change their composition. To move people around, to relocate people, to displace people, to place people in certain places and so on. I think to people now in Greece over the last couple of years, there is no more than a direct example of how this actually operates. So let's go over each of these categories and so on, if I already talked about it. Okay, so people as targets. Think about it, we're going after Bin Laden. We're going after Muqtada al-Sadr. We're going after the personification. That's one aspect of the people. We're engaging in micro-targeting, both on the physical sense, on the cognitive sense of the life. So we want to be specific in going after some physical, cognitive, or logical effects that are quite targeted against a people or group of people. It could be the one that we're trying to do this domestically, and it could be done that we're trying to do it internationally. Look at Trump and the Muslims as an example, that you're trying to categorize a certain population and say, these people are trouble. These are the ones I want to target. I want to target them with physical means. They won't get into the United States. I want to target them by detention. I want to target them by monitoring them. I want to target them by imposing other economic sanctions against them. And I want to target them to arrest them. And I want to target them to kill them. And I want to target them to intimidate them. Some of the most dramatic aspects of what ISIS was doing was decapitation and beheading. To use the decapitation and beheading as a societal warfare instrument. We're seeing human trafficking as a use aspect of societal warfare where the people are the targets. But so are kidnapping and hijacking. We're seeing how sex is being employed as an instrument of warfare, both. We saw some of it, of course, in antiquity, but we're seeing this now on a much larger scale. Both in who you target, right? Those who win actually get the benefits, but also as a way of rewarding the soldiers in some of those confrontations that we're seeing. So the people are as a target, to use them as a reward, but also to use them as someone that you actually attack. I've already talked about intimidation, harassment, persecution, blackmail, corruption, but also bribery. And the Russians, of course, use extensively of what they call compromising, and so on. So people as targets. Just a second. Excuse me for my technical incompetence. People as weapons. Look at this whole list. I don't want to take forever and go every single item of those, but the people are being used as weapons. Whether they're used as human shields, or recently in Gaza, they're actually hoping that we would kill those innocent Palestinians protesting on the border because some of the Hamas warriors are hiding among them and so on, and the Hamas pushes them to the fence and so on, and then wants to get those images, send them internationally to discredit and delegitimize Israel. So they're taking advantage of an incredible human tragedy, and they're trying to manipulate it as a strategy of warfare. And of course we've seen that in casualties, causing casualties. And by the way, when I mean casualties, you would see that the exercise is saying it's much more important to hurt people than to kill them. Because everyone you hurt actually becomes such a liability from a logistical point of view and moral point of view and so on, that it's much more important to hurt people than to kill them. Because then they become we're seeing increasingly the efforts to use settlers as an instrument of warfare. And it could be Russians in eastern Ukraine, and it could be Iranians that are being brought, Iranians and other Shias that are brought to Lebanon, to Syria, and we're seeing in a different form also, the way Israel is trying to use its settlers. I want to talk just all of these examples. I mentioned just the last one. It has even become a game that holding on to corpses or turning them back has become an instrument of warfare, of whether it's the suicide bombers or others who are engaged in warfare. So, we used to think that there is exchange of prisoners of war and corpses are, the decency requires that those be handed over and so on. None of this is really happening anymore. General Rupert Smith, talked about war amongst the people and said that the modern characteristic of warfare was war amongst the people. Occurring in population centers. But it's not just occurring in population centers. The most dramatic aspect, the most frightening aspect, that it occurs with emphasis on schools, on religious shrines, on hospitals, on markets. And so we've seen that in Berlin, we've seen that in Nice, we have seen that in other places. And so it's not just within an urban area, but it's in the areas which are the most heavily concentrated population, the most vulnerable population, and the ones that we thought that the lure roles of armed conflict prevented from using as military objects. And one of the reasons for this is because when the urban areas are such media hypes, and not to mention that there are people that you can support, and so on. And the war is occurring in media and new media, which again is a very social things, and so on. An extremely important aspect is the ethnic diasporas and ethnic bridgeheads, which are being both created and manipulated, and so on. If someone, I think the most interesting presentation I've heard about the Syrian civil war has been how the Assad regime is using population relocation as the most important instrument of war, both of who you're trying to move away, including into push into Europe and so on, but also who you're trying to resettle. And the Iranians are doing the same, and the Chinese are doing the same with Hans in Xinjiang province and so on, and the Russians are doing the same with their own population. And of course I already talked about the psychological and cognitive battlefield. So we are dealing with societal tools that are specialized, that are new, that are different, that are important, that are unorthodox, that are readily accessible. But we're also dealing with the employment of military standard, military capabilities to try and influence societies. And you have here all the list of those items and so on. So, I want to conclude and then suggest we take a break so you can actually get a break from me and break from the heavy stuff I'm loading on you. By saying a few of the challenges of adapting to cope with societal warfare. The first slide was already telling you that in my view, the biggest challenge is a paradigmatic challenge. Is the paradigm through which we look at reality, the prism through which we look at reality, has to change. We're still wedded to a classic paradigm. That classic paradigm has not completely gone out of the window. It's not the entire. We have to be prepared for it, but we also have to be prepared for a very different type of reality, which in fact is much more likely to occur. In fact, is occurring all the time. The second aspect that I think to the military distinguished officers here in the room, I think would be just as important. We need to find a way of translating some of the military concepts into a societal reality. What does center of gravity actually mean in societal warfare? What does Schwerpunkt mean? What does victory mean? If it's not measured anymore as conquest and destruction of military gear, how do we achieve victory? What does it mean? So there is a paradigmatic And alongside of this, there is an important terminological confrontation that we have to engage in to try and use to the extent of possible, or to give new meaning to key terms that are indeed very profound, but around which our entire thinking and organization are built. I've already alluded to the fact that we need to integrate into this type of confrontation different disciplines. I've already alluded to the behavioral studies as a necessary discipline and so on. So psychology, psychiatry, behavioral economics and so on is just as important as the traditional skills we used to teach in military academies and so on. There is another problem which may be the most difficult in some respects. We have built the constitutional arrangements around the separation between peace and war, between the roles of the military that are external and the role of public order agencies that are internal, and so on. So we have made all of those differences. But do those have... Does those stand to reason in this situation where we're engaging in societal warfare? I got an email this morning from Washington, which was talking about the big fight that is going on now within the Pentagon, about the role of cyber and the military in peacetime. Not in fighting other military organizations, but in fighting the ongoing cyber war that is already taking place between the US and its rivals. So the constitutional aspect is even more important if you assume that for multiple reasons, ranging from the organization, the capacity to plan, the capacity to think strategy, the guiding principle, the ethics and so on, the military organizations are better equipped to think along these lines than civilian equivalents. And yet, some of these functions that we're talking about here, to employ information technologies, to employ economic means, to employ political and psychological means and so on, are fundamentally not lying outside the traditional military's areas of, not just competence, like outside the military's traditional areas of responsibility. We knew how to organize military elements to fight opposing military forces. So we built brigades and corps and divisions and so on, and military structures and regional responsibilities and so on. How much of this is still relevant in today's end when this is the confrontation? It's global, it's diffuse, it's autonomous, and so on and so forth. We need to try and struggle with those. And there is no... a lot of the changes that we're talking about here may be politically unpopular. Talking to the Americans and getting them to admit that what they were doing in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in other places was fundamentally political in nature and fundamentally societal warfare was a taboo. You couldn't get them to admit that that's what they're doing. The Russians are doing it. We're not doing it. Really? That's not what you're doing? Okay. There are fundamental ethical issues involved here. What is appropriate? What is legitimate? What is absolutely necessary? How do we reinterpret the laws of armed conflict in a way that still has meaning and bounding impact in this domain and so on? And of course we have to think about this hard, to take it all and put it all kind of in a strategic context to try and understand who we are facing up to, how do we need to deal with them, and so on, and develop those into kind of one's mainstream strategy that is supposed to deal with the challenges, the security challenges of the present and the future. Let me conclude. I would conclude by just saying, ahead of our discourse, and I remind you again that this is not going to be just a monologue, is that I think we're dealing with a fundamentally different reality. It's not a reality for which there were no precedents or that we haven't seen elements of many of these items before. We have seen probably every permutation in one capacity or another in future, in past conflicts, in past thinking about strategy and so on. I think that they now come all together and that they have become so dominant requires us a fundamental rethink of how we think on the theoretical level, on the conceptual level, and also on the practical level. And to me, that is what is incumbent on us to do. And I was heartened to come to Piraeus, and particularly to this seminar, because I understood that you're here, you're trying to do two things. One is to groom future leaders who are able to think about these challenges, and B, as was clear from the General Stefanis and also the other military officers here in the room, to understand that you're actually doing that kind of interaction and want to do even more of that. So, both as a research program, which is what we academics typically seek refuge in, and also as a policy-relevant or strategy-relevant exercise that is trying to help the people who are ultimately on the front line and would be confronted with these challenges and perhaps harshly judged and unjustifiably judged if they don't deliver successfully on confronting some of those. So you have not just my sympathy, but pledge of support in undertaking this. So now let's take a break. Thank you.
Well, before we take a break, I would like to pose one question to all of you that we can debate it when we will come back. Probably you heard the most radical reinterpretation of war since Clausewitz. What he said, it's a completely new rewriting of the traditional strategy textbooks. So it's, at the philosophical level, it's a completely different interpretation of war and strategy. So it's something completely breakthrough. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that strategy was always, at the level of grand strategy at least, total. So societies, technology, weapons, they were always used in different combinations according to different problems. So actually it's nothing new, but it's just new wine in an old bottle.